Hey, anybody can present, but are you persuasive? Anybody can inform. Are you influential? We're going to talk about today how to turn your presentations into persuasion. This is the secret sauce to connect and build trust, to bypass the logical mind, to help market your product, brand your product, and best of all, speak to the part of the brain where decisions are made. Do you want to know what it is? Let's do it.
Maximize your influence. Kurt Mortensen is the author of Persuasion IQ, Laws of Charisma, and the best-selling book, Maximum Influence.
Welcome to Podcast 589. Kurt Mortensen here. Maximize your influence. Yeah, my voice is mending this week. Still a little hoarse. Has been doing a lot of recording and speaking. So what I wanted to do is bring back a popular guest we've had before. Paul Smith, he's the author of Lead with the Story. We've talked about stories before because it is the quickest, easiest, fastest, bestest way to trigger an emotion. And we all know emotions are more persuasive than logic. One of the things I do is teach a 3-day seminar on storytelling for leaders because branding, recruiting, marketing, advertising, motivating, all comes back to a story. You can't have the riz, you can't have the charisma without knowing how to tell stories. I'm just saying, stories persuade faster than logic. They simplify complex ideas. They build trust. They connect you with people. They grab people's attention. They can be totally zoned out. Oh, story. And it increases retention. So let's go to this interview with Paul Smith. Let my voice heal a little bit. Let's do it. All right, I'd like to give a warm welcome to Paul Smith to the Maximize Your Influence podcast. We got some great information for you. So first of all, Paul, welcome to the show.
Hey, Kurt, thanks very much for having me on.
Hey, it's great to have you. We're going to have some great information. Encourage everyone to take notes, and again, unless you're driving. Let me lead off with kind of an introduction with Paul. Paul Smith is one of the world's leading experts on organizational storytelling. He's a keynote speaker, storytelling coach, and author of the book Sell with the Story, Parenting with the Story, and the bestseller Lead with the Story, already in its 8th printing and available in 6 languages around the world. Paul is also the former consultant for Accenture and former executive and 20-year veteran of Procter & Gamble Company. It's so good to have you, but we have to start off with our very first question. Let's throw you for a loop here. You have to tell our listeners what is the worst vegetable on the planet and why.
Yeah, I'm a pretty big vegetable fan as an adult. I remember not being as a kid. There are some that I don't like, and I guess top of mind for me would be onions. I don't like them, and I think the reason is not the taste or the consistency or anything, but just the way it makes my breath smell, and I guess I don't like that, especially if I'm going to be at home around my wife. So onions are off my list.
All right, we'll put a mark in for onions. Is that cooked or uncooked or both?
Uncooked. If you cook them, I think it works out better in that department. So,
all right,
in the romance department.
Onions on the list. I think that's the first time we've had onions, but we'll take it. I think the top one, as our listener knows, is Brussels sprouts being the top. Not sure we can eat that slimy vegetable list.
Now, see, I actually like Brussels sprouts.
But, I hear that. There's nothing in between with Brussels sprouts. It's either you like them
or hate it, yeah.
Right in the middle. So let's dive in and talk about storytelling. I love storytelling. I love selling with stories. Let's ask you this. What exactly is a sales story? How's that different from a persuasive presentation or a sales pitch? I mean, what are we talking about here?
Yeah, great question, because I think that word story has been misused over the last couple of decades. So a sales story, as I define it, is very different than a sales pitch. So first of all, a sales story is a real story. That is a narrative about something that happened to somebody. And what that means is there's a time and a place and a main character, and that main character's got a goal, and there's probably somebody or something getting in the way of that goal, and there are events that transpire throughout the narrative that hopefully resolve themselves nicely in the end. So it literally is a story about something that happened to somebody, as opposed to a sales pitch, which is, let me tell you the 3 reasons why you should buy my product today. A sales pitch is essentially a list. It's a list of reasons why you should do something that I want you to do, which is normally to buy what I'm selling. And you've got to have a sales pitch if you're selling anything. I'm not saying we should get rid of sales pitches. My suggestion is that you should add to your repertoire of sales skills the ability to tell stories to add to and augment your sales pitches and your rapport building and your objection handling and your sale closing, and all of the parts, the phases of a sales process could be helped by having a sales story. So a sales story literally is a real story about something that happened to somebody that helps you achieve your sales goal.
Great point. Hope the listeners caught that. Instead of vomiting the features and benefits in that long list, you get another tool, which is a very persuasive tool. And I'm a big believer that stories are effective. And through my research, I've found that stories pretty much persuade without detection a lot of times. What are your top 2 or 3 reasons stories are so effective in this process?
Yeah, so the first one is that storytelling speaks to that part of the brain where we actually make decisions. A lot of the cognitive science that's been done in the last few years tells us that human beings actually make subconscious, emotional, sometimes irrational decisions in this one place in their brain. And then a few nanoseconds later, we rationalize that decision logically in a different place in our brain. So we leave it thinking that we've made this very rational, logical decision. But the truth is we made a very quick, spontaneous, unconscious, emotional decision. And all those features and benefits you mentioned earlier, that list of rational reasons why you should buy something, only appeals to one part of the brain. If you want to reach that other part where the decisions are typically made in advance, you need to influence people emotionally. And storytelling is a much more effective tool at doing that than a bunch of logical lists. That's the main reason. A couple others I'd mention quickly. One is that stories makes things easier to remember, right? The number of studies have shown that facts are between 6 and 22 times more likely to be remembered if they're embedded in a story than if they're given to people in a list or just in sequence. That's obviously part of what you need people to do is remember your whole sales pitch. So if you can include a story in that, that'll help. But it actually increases the value of the product you're selling as well in many cases, because once you've told them the story, they're not just buying a thing, they're buying a story that comes with it. And that story has some value.
I love that. They're going to remember you more, your product more, just by telling a story. And I can't think of a persuasive presentation that wouldn't have a story. But let me ask you this. As you were doing your research for this book, what were the couple of things that you found out that just blew your mind as far as how powerful stories are?
Yeah, well, there were several surprises, actually. The first one was the enormous set of places during the sales process where great salespeople were telling stories. Because I ended up interviewing salespeople at over 50 different organizations around the world. Places like Microsoft and Costco and Xerox and Abercrombie and Fitch and Hewlett Packard, even Ghirardelli Chocolates and Children's Hospital. All kinds of different industries. And what I found, I thought people would use storytelling just kind of in that rapport building phase where, you're getting to know each other and story about me growing up or where I went to school and all that kind of stuff. But what I found, great salespeople were using it all the way from the moment they introduced themselves to a prospect, to preparing for the sales call, yes, to that rapport building phase, but actually making the sales pitch itself, handling objections in that sales call, using storytelling to do that, actually closing the sale by telling stories, and then even managing customer relationships after the sale. So that was a surprise to me, just that there were so many uses of storytelling in sales. But there were some other interesting things too, like one set of people that I interviewed were not salespeople. They were buyers, so professional procurement managers at companies who, and I guess that makes sense. Who better to tell you what sales stories work and which ones don't work than the professional buyers who are actually making the decision after listening to dozens of sales pitches all day. But one of the things I asked them was, what makes a sales pitch sound like a sales pitch? And I got all kinds of interesting answers to that a lot of them described interesting or very colorful ways to describe the act of vomiting, which I found at least entertaining. But they all almost had the same answers. And the answer was when the tone of the conversation changed from conversational and improvisational to something that sounded memorized and scripted. And they said you can tell when the tone of voice of somebody changes and they're reciting something that they've memorized. They would say, that's when I knew the sales pitch had started. And they'd say the hairs on the back of my neck would just stand up, And that's when my defenses would go up and I knew that it was game on, right? And I needed to get my game face on and be very, resist what's about to happen to me. And so you don't want that to happen, right? And that's one of the beautiful things about a story is that it doesn't sound like a sales pitch. So that never happens. Those hackles and those hairs don't rise up on the back of the neck so that they just will listen to your story without all those defenses up.
Oh, that's great information. The power of stories and how that can help you out. What separates a great story? Because I've heard some great stories and a story that's just not working. I mean, what is the difference between a boring story and a story that's engaging, they're listening, and they're being persuaded?
Yeah, so there are a number of things, and I've got basically a chapter in the book on each of these things, but I'll just give you the top two or three. And one is the structure of the story. So stories do have a structure, and if you're going to write a screenplay or a novel or something like that, you probably have a very long story structure. But sales stories are short, and so one of the things I learned was that the average sales story is 2 minutes long. 2, not 5, not 10, not 20, not a half an hour. Now, I'm not talking about the entire presentation. I just mean individual stories. You might tell 2 or 3 stories during the course of a half hour sales pitch, and you might tell several other stories even when you're not in the sales pitch. You're just building rapport or meeting somebody. But the average length of that story is 2 minutes long. And so you've got to have a very short story structure. And so what I found is there are 8 questions that your story needs to answer, and in this order. And if they don't, it's really going to make your story hard to work. So here are those 8 questions. One is, why should I listen to this story? If you don't answer that well, they may not listen to your story. But after that, then the main questions are, where and when did it take place? Who's the main character and what did they want? What was the problem or opportunity they ran into? What did they do about it? And how did it turn out in the end? All right. Now, if you're keeping track, that's only 6. So the story is technically done, but there are 2 other questions you've got to answer for your prospect. And that is, what did you learn from the story? You, the salesperson, when you first heard that story or when it first happened. And then lastly, what do you think they should do about it? What should your audience, the prospect or the buyer, do differently now that they've heard this story? So that's your opportunity to make a recommendation or launch into your sales pitch or conclude your sales pitch. Those 8 questions, if you don't answer those questions, your story is going to fall flat because, you skipped the where and the when it took place. Or you didn't really explain who the main character was and how that's, or the thing that happened that made the whole story transpire. So it just didn't make any sense. So one thing is that structure. But I'd say the other 2 things are emotion and surprise. So if your story doesn't contain some emotional, moment, then it's just not going to be as engaging or interesting of a story. And if it doesn't have anything unexpected in it, it doesn't have to be a big surprise ending, but that's nice. But if there's nothing surprising at all in it, again, it's just not going to be that memorable and not be that impactful. So I've got a number of techniques for people to use to help develop both emotion and surprise in the stories, because those are really important.
Yeah, those are great questions. I especially like the 2 minutes. Just get to the point. It doesn't have to be that long. I think that's a great takeaway for our listeners out there. But let me ask, we're big into blunders on the show or mistakes. When people do tell those stories, what are the biggest mistakes or blunders you see that people could fix?
The first one is not adhering to those principles. So like not answering all 8 questions or not having emotion or surprise. But other than that, the most common one I see is the way they start out their story. And like one of the worst ways to start out your story is to apologize or ask permission to tell the story, right? And you see this happen all the time. There'll be 6 or 8 people sitting in a room around a conference table and they're talking and somebody raises their hand and they'll say, I'm sorry to interrupt, but can I just tell a quick story? I promise it'll just take a minute, right? We do that all the time. What do you think that communicates to the rest of the people in the room about how important your story is? What do you think?
Oh, that's terrible. That's like saying, hey, can I try to persuade you? You're going to get instant resistance, and now the logical mind is kicked in. And, I mean, that thing about that story is it kicks into the subconscious mind, that emotional side that you talked about. So I'm with you on that one. Yeah,
so just don't do that. Don't apologize for telling a story. Don't ask permission to tell a story. I mean, salespeople don't ask permission to do their jobs, do they? No, just do your job. Leaders don't ask permission to lead. They just lead. So never apologize or ask permission to tell a story. In fact, don't even announce that you're going to tell a story, right? Because a lot of people just have this negative, visceral reaction to being told, well, gather around, boys and girls. It's story time. I'm going to tell you a story. I mean, if it was a bunch of kindergartners you're talking to, that's fine. But you're probably talking to an adult, and they don't need to be told. They're going to be told a story because that'll just make their eyes roll in the back of their head. Just start telling the story.
Great info. Thanks for sharing that. But let me ask you another question here. How do we become better storytellers? What can we do? Because you probably said people think we're born with it or we're not. How do we become better storytellers and better at persuasion?
Many people do make that assumption that, well, you're either born with it or you'll just never have it. And I just think that is not true. In fact, it's not true the same way that art or music. That's not true about art or music. There are definitely people who are born musicians or born artists, at least having a natural aptitude and talent for that. And I'm not one of those people, by the way. But I'll bet if I wanted to learn to play the guitar, what would I go do? I would go take guitar lessons. Well, first of all, I'd buy a guitar, and then I would go take guitar lessons for a few months. And then I would practice every day. It's the exact same with storytelling. If you're not a natural born storyteller, you can become a decent storyteller, even a very good storyteller. Now, you may not become the best storyteller in the world because it's not your natural gift, but absolutely you can learn it like any other skill by, first of all, learning how. So don't just say, well, I just need to tell more stories and practice more. Like you wouldn't just say, well, I just need to practice my guitar more in order to get better. Well, yeah, if you already know how to play the guitar, that works great. But if you have no idea what those strings do, practicing won't help you because you don't know what you're doing. So start out by admitting this is something I don't know how to do. I need to learn how, and then I need to work on it on a regular basis. So buy a book, take a class, learn from somebody who knows what they're doing, find a way to learn it the right way, and then practice it.
I like that. So it's a skill that we can learn, a skill we have to learn, especially in the world of persuasion, influence, negotiation, and sales. Let me ask you this. What have I missed here? What if I haven't asked you? What's the one thing that you can tell our Maximize Your Influence listeners that they really need to know about telling stories?
One thing they probably need to do more of is getting their prospects and their buyers to tell more stories. So it's one thing to know how to tell a story as a salesperson. But if you really want to understand your buyers, what their needs are so that you can meet those needs better, you need them to tell you their story. So, for example, imagine asking a prospect or a buyer, tell me what your biggest problem is. Oh, well, that would be warehousing. Warehousing is always our biggest issue or whatever. Okay, so now you know one word, something about warehousing. But imagine instead if you could get them to tell you a real story about something that happened in their warehouse, bad, so that you could really understand on a more detailed level what went wrong. And the way you might do that is ask them a question like this. Tell me about the moment you realized your biggest problem was your biggest problem. That almost forces them to tell you a story instead of give you a one-word answer. So they'd have to say, oh, gosh, well, that would have been about 6 months ago when we had that warehouse fire, and then they'll tell you all about the warehouse fire. Or they'll tell you, oh, well, yeah, that'd be when last month when our biggest customer had an emergency order. We went out to the warehouse and we didn't have the product that they needed. And so we had to schedule a special production run to make it and got it made just in time and expedited to their location at all this huge extra expense. And then we went out to the warehouse and found exactly what they ordered right where it was supposed to be all along. That was when we knew we had a warehouse problem. Okay, so now you know something very different about the warehouse problem. So getting your buyers to tell you complete stories, not just one-word answers, yes or no answers, short answer type things, that is another skill with storytelling. It's how to elicit stories that will help you, not just tell them.
I like that. That's great information. So when you get them to kick into that emotional side, tell a story, not only are you getting information, but it probably opens them up to more persuasion.
Yeah, you're finding out what their pain points are, especially.
Yeah, which is all about influence. Mm-hmm. Well, Paul, this has been great information. Appreciate your time. Let me ask you one final thing. Where can the listeners find out more about you and about telling stories and in your work?
Yeah, thanks. My website's probably the easiest place to do that, and that is leadwithastory.com. And there's links there to the book, Sell with a Story, and to the training courses that I teach on that topic.
Great information. Again, thanks for being here. That's leadwithastory.com. Listeners, make sure you internalize this information. You learn these new tools of influence.
Hey, and go out and persuade with power.